got a child-free morning this morning, so I'm going to talk to you about felted wool wraps. There are some commonly held beliefs about wool and felting that worry people, and I thought it was worth unpacking them because they're not as cut and dry as it would first appear, and by understanding what's going on, you can make better judgments about your own wraps and hopefully feel more confident using wool. So, one issue is that people tend to assume that wraps are either felted or they're not felted. And we'll hear people ask, is my wrap felted? The second thing that goes alongside that is the worry that felted wraps are unsafe. So let's look at the first one first. Felting is a process, and your wrap can be anywhere along that process. It happens through alkalinity, through friction, through rapid change in temperature, and not magic, just scientific changes. And so your wrap those changes can have started in your wrap and go right through to the point where the wool cannot change anymore. That's fully felted. And if your wrap is at that point, you do not need to ask anyone if it's felted because you'll know. But that does mean that your wrap can be slightly felted, right through to completely felted, or not at all. Another complication is that most wool wraps will arrive in loom state, where the wool isn't even in its natural state. It's far more tightly bound, far more constricted, and so it won't, that's sort of like extending the range even further. So your wrap can change an awful lot from how it looked in loom state and before it even starts to get onto that continuum. So it's hard to say if your wrap is felted or not. It might be a little bit felted, it might not, it might be very fluffy. It only matters when we have this concept that felted wraps are unsafe, because then any wrap that is on any part of the continuum that sort of looks even the slightest bit fluffy worries us. So, when we say that felted wraps are unsafe, a completely felted wrap will have lost all its diagonal stretch, it will have shrunk and puckered, it will be incredibly grippy, and it will be very, very difficult to use in the manner that it was intended. It will be unsuitable to wrap with. Potentially, you will not be able to use that wrap safely to carry your child, just in the way that you would struggle to use other pieces of cloth that weren't intended for purpose of carrying children, to carry your child safely. Some cloth, bath towels for example, are not made for carrying children but do the job excellently because they have the properties that we need for carrying children comfortably and safely. And a felted wool wrap that's completely felted has probably already lost those properties. So that is the safety concern. But because felting is a continuum, it is not helpful to ask, is my wrap felted? It is better to ask, does my cloth still have the properties that it needs to have in order for me to use it comfortably and safely? And therefore you can judge every wrap individually rather than trying to work out if a wrap is felted or not. It really doesn't matter if a wrap is felted. What matters is it safe to use still? So the process could have started, but as long as that wrap still has the properties that you need, then it is a usable wrap. And because we worry that all wraps that look slightly fluffy are unsafe, we then carry on using that extended bit of the range where we barely get our wraps out of loom state for fear that they are felted. And what we consider felting is actually usually the normal fluffy woolly feel of wool. So right, what I want to show you is two pieces of cloth here. One is a cowl that has been returned to us because its owner was concerned that she'd felted it. Another is a wrap that has been washed once and is barely out of loom state. Same wrap, same Fantasia Aqua Curves of Pursuit, 50% wool, so the weft is pure wool and the warp is cotton. One thing to digress and mention is that we're not talking about making actual felt that is just wool here, that you can put your fingers through and that has different properties to other fibres. Wraps have a cotton warp for the most part, and the warp is what gives the wrap its strength. The weft is not weight bearing. The weft can kind of just fall apart. It's the integrity of the cloth through the weave that gives it the strength. You can get a fully felted wrap and you're not going to be able to put your fingers through it. The cloth is strong. It's probably not suitable for purpose anymore, but there seems to be a fear that felted cloth is somehow, its integrity has been compromised. And if you can wrap with it, if you can wrap your child safely and get them attached to you in a way that still meets all the safety criteria, then you can still use it. But it's just unlikely that you're going to be able to do that. So, let's see, this is the pretty much brand new wrap. You can see that the wool threads, the orange and red ones there, are still very, very neat and tight. You can see a lot of little white, or they look white on here, they're blue dots of warp showing through. You can still see the structure. They're not very fluffy at all yet. It still feels a little bit rough and not particularly woolly, not as woolly as it could. It has diagonal stretch and the width that I need, and it's going to function fine as a wrap, but it has further to go before it has reached its potential as wool. You know, we should celebrate the qualities of wool. The weft colours are a little bit muted because they mix with the aqua warp. Now this is a cowl that has been washed in a Woolmark European machine on the correct settings. It has changed. It has got narrower. All wool wraps will become narrower because as the fibres loosen and reach their proper state, they contract the cloth. It's always going to happen. It's narrower. The colour is more saturated, and when you get up close, it is a lot fluffier, and it is harder to distinguish the individual threads. There. It feels beautiful and soft and warm and fluffy compared to this, which still feels a little bit more rough and sackclothy. However, because of this worry that felted wraps are unsafe and that felting is sort of a finite process, this has become an unsatisfactory form for a wrap or a cowl to take, when actually this is probably closer to how it should feel. It still has lots and lots of diagonal stretch, lots of movement. Yes, it's narrower. Yes, the fibres are a lot fluffier, but there we go. I've pulled out one of the fibres. Can you see? It's still a distinct thread. It's not blended to the point where it's like this wool, where all the fibres have merged together. You can still individually pull them out. It's just very fluffy. There we go. So even though this looks so different to this cloth and feels so different, we could still say, obviously it's a cowl, so it's not even weight bearing, but we could still say, well, if it has the width that we need, it has the diagonal stretch that we need, it still is able to be wrapped with, it's not too grippy, it's still got the properties that we're looking for in a wrap, then it is still fine to use. So even a wrap that was more obviously along the scale of felting, if it still bears those properties, it is still fine to use, and you need to look at them on an individual basis. Yeah, I think that's everything I wanted to say to you. So look at your wraps, look at your wool wraps, wash them and decide before you worry that it's felted just because it's fluffy or because it has changed from how it looked when you got it in the bag, decide, does it still have the stretch? Does it still have enough width? It might become slightly uneven on the edge because loom stake cloth, when it's sewn, is under tension, and if that tension is ever so slightly different to different places, then once it contracts, it'll contract slightly differently. But a slight wobble in the edge is not the same as puckering, which is very, very noticeable. So don't write off wool wraps just because they've changed their state. Think about the criteria we're looking for in a wrap. Does it still meet those criteria for being able to be used comfortably and safely with your baby? And if it does, then use it.